The archive of the Arsenal Institute for Film and Video Art encompasses around 10,000 films, which, at the time they were made, had sought to counter the already existing canon. They sought to use the possibilities of cinema to change it, and thus to question power relations. Such an archive cannot per se be bound by organizational criteria. It is not a national archive. It does not depict any genre nor any historical era. It resists any kind of interpretational sovereignty. It is an archive in motion. The only thing that unifies it in this resistance is perhaps its location, the fact that it is located in Berlin. This film, Meshes of the Afternoon, which is a film by Maya Deren from 1943, stayed with us after it was shown in the Forum in 1974 in the context of a Maya Deren retrospective. It was shown together with films by Man Ray, Stan Brakhage, Werner Nickes, Raul Rus, Sohrab Shahizales, Sergei Eisenstein, and others. All of them films which you would consider as examples of what we would call a counter-cinema in relation to aesthetics and politics. They stayed in the Arsenal archive after the festival. How do films shape the characteristics of an archive? When you identify them as counter-cinema, does that make our archive a counter-archive? In comparison to what? Or is this film shaped by the characteristics of the Arsenal archive? Or to be more specific, by the other films which are also in the archive? And now I actually wanted to show you another print, a copy of the very same film, which was not found at the archive in Berlin, but at the ADA, the Archive of the Avant-Garde here in Dresden. But I can't show it to you because it's right now in Berlin. So the Berlin print is here and the Dresden print is in Berlin. And the Dresden print, when it's here, is surrounded by non-film objects, other objects. And the question would be, is it then really the same film if it's not in a film archive, but at the ADA? Maybe there is something that connects the two archives, which can be found in the film itself. The surreal effect in Deren's first films emerges through the montage of elements of space and time. Hans Scheugel and Ernst Schmidt Jr. wrote in Eine Subgeschichte des Films, in Meshes, she is sleeping on a fauteuil while she simultaneously is sitting at a table vis-à-vis. Through the window, she watches herself following a dark figure which disappears behind a bend. While approaching a sleeper, holding a knife which repeatedly transforms into a key, suddenly a man appears in her place, whom she finally throws the knife in the face. Or as Filipa earlier put it, Maya Deren edits in a way that brings her films or brings something moving forward. Some films stayed after the festival. Others were given to us by filmmakers who wanted their films to be among the others, which were already there, or they have been acquired by Arsenal's curator Alf Bolt, for example, whose specialty was the avant-garde cinema. Some films needed to be protected, like some Soviet films, which came to us after the war came down. That happened because they, after the Soviet army left, somebody tried to extract the silver from the film prints that they had in Berlin while they were there to make money out of the silver. And that, of course, destroys the films, and to rescue them, the founders of the Arsenal, Erika and Ulrich Gregor, bought the entire archive. So this is a reason why we have now so many Soviet films. Yet other films needed a safe place, shelter, because of censorship. Films from Chile and Argentina in the 1960s, China and Burma in the 1990s, or just recently films from Iran or Saudi Arabia. Some of them, like those from Chile, were given back later. As film, is a medium that has no original. They can be in 2 or more places at the same time, not in this case. That means it is possible to give them back and to keep them. And that was already the case before digitization, but now it is even easier. Although I would give you 2 examples for why materiality actually plays an important role in that. One example is the films, or many of the films that stayed with us after the festival, stayed with us because we had made extra prints with German subtitles. And that was not done for archive purpose, but in order to circulate them after the festival in German-speaking countries. And then decades later, in many cases, it was found out that those prints in the meantime had become the only surviving prints, which makes them now the original, but they have the German subtitles inscripted in the print. And if you then want to return them to the countries where they were produced, you have to get rid of the subtitles again, which is a problem. And funnily, or maybe it's not so funny, but since our archive is very international, there is no German funding for digitization or restoration, as they are not national heritage. This goes only for German films. But because of the possibility to return them to the countries, we often get funding from the foreign ministry. And then when you digitize the film, you have possibilities to remove the subtitles, because if we give a film back to India, they don't need the German subtitles there. But this is very expensive, although you can find there are ways to remove them completely. But what we do is we do a blurring above the subtitles, and then in the digital version you can put other subtitles on top of that, and it stays like a scar in the digital version. So there is something that reminds you that this film has a history of, like a print history, print-related history. And the other example is that it's actually not so easy all the times to ship analog film prints from one country to another. If you have tried to do that from, for example, travel from Germany to Egypt with analog prints, you get into trouble. You might get into trouble. So we are currently working on a new edition to our archive. And we can discuss later whether it's really an addition or something that will change our archive. Films which found shelter not at the Arsenal, but at Cimatek Alternative Film Center in Cairo, which can clearly be considered a counter-archive, as opposed to the National Archive, which does exist, but is not at all accessible. However, due to the political situation in Cairo, the archive, the Cimatek archive, is now in the need of a shelter itself. A digital copy of it will soon be in Berlin. Will it still be the same archive? This is what we are going to discuss here, and we have some guests, and Tamer, Tamer El-Said, who I will soon introduce, will first give a little presentation of the Cimatek archive, and then we have 2 respondents. Filipa César, she is an artist and filmmaker interested in the porous borders between the moving image and its reception, fictional dimensions of the documentary, and the economies, politics, and poetics inherent to cinema praxis. She uses media to expose counter-narratives of resistance to historism. Her feature-length film, Spell Real, is the result of a research and digitization project that she initiated in 2011 with Sana Nada and Flora Gomes. Having studied film in Cuba, the 2 began using the camera to observe the fight for independence in Guinea-Bissau from 1963 to 1974. After the decaying visual and audio material was brought to the Arsenal in Berlin, where it was digitized. The analog footage, as well as the digitized material, was brought back to Guinea-Bissau. Digital copies stayed in Berlin. And Filipa also showed it in Guinea-Bissau using a mobile cinema that ended in Berlin. And then we don't have Ali, no, it's already corrected. Ali Atef, who's announced in the program, is not here with us. He couldn't come for visa reasons. And instead we have Mohamad Shawky Hassan, an Egyptian filmmaker currently based in Berlin. His work has been shown at Berlinale, HKW, the Contemporary Image Collective CIC in Cairo, and in many other places, and acquired by the Museum of Modern Art in New York. He taught at Cairo Institute for Liberal Arts and Science, the German University in Cairo, and the Arab Digital Expression Foundation. In 2016, he completed his MA in philosophy at the American University in Cairo, where he studied with Professor Graham Harman and wrote his thesis titled On the Limitations of the Archive, Effective Traces, Sensible Intensities, and the Humming Background Noise of the Universe. But first, I would like to introduce, or last but not least, I would like to introduce Tamer, the first speaker. He's a filmmaker and producer living in Berlin and Cairo. He studied filmmaking and journalism and went on to make documentaries and short films, as well as his first feature-length film, In the Last Days of the City, which premiered in the Berlinale Forum in 2016. The film has been invited to over 160 festivals and won more than 15 international awards, maybe more in the meantime. Tamer is co-founder of Cimatec Alternative Film Center in Cairo, which I already mentioned, a multi-purpose space that provides facilities, training, and programming for the independent filmmaking community. Cimatec opened its doors in 2015 and also runs a library, a moving image archive, and a lab. And as I said before, the archive was built around a sense of urgency in a context where the state doesn't give people any access to their moving image history. It opens its growing collection to the public, questioning the official narrative and giving space to marginalized narratives to exist. Please, Tamer Essayed.
Thank you, Stefanie. I'm very happy to be here. I understand that this is a very late panel, and I'm sure many people are having this archive fatigue. This is a new term that was invented today by Shawky and Stefanie. No, I'm joking. No, we just want to say something that I feel like, because we miss Ali Atif in this panel, and it's strange that still we are not able to have people because of this visa issues. And I'm happy that at least films doesn't need a visa, and I hope that this will continue. Otherwise, we will not be able to show many films. So I start by giving a quick presentation of like just showing what Cimatec is quickly, and then we go through the collection, and I will present some items of this collection to you just to discuss this main question that we have today. How archive is, does archive stay the same if we change the context, or archive is something very connected to here and now? So this is our main theme today. Oh, it's already there. So this is how we define Cimatec. It's we say Cimatec Alternative Film Center in downtown Cairo believes in the diversity of the cinematic art and hopes to create a space in which audience, film practitioners, critics, and other specialists can exchange ideas, experiences, and participate in an open discussion regarding films. Cimatec's service and programs include film screenings, a specialized workshop, a library, a moving image archive, and a lab for Super 8 and 16mm analog film. Since opening in 2015, Cimatec has screened over 200 films, including many premiering for the first time in Egypt. It has organized more than 15 intensive workshops, seminars, and lecture series addressing the needs of local filmmakers, students, and writers, from which over 500 participants have benefited. In addition to its public programming, Cinematech has built an archive based on donated material from film practitioners who deeply believed in its mission. The archive houses diverse material, including found footage, home movies, amateur films, manuscripts, documents, photographs, rare film magazines, official reports, diaries, and film storyboards. Cinematech also has a film scanner that has allowed many individuals to preserve their personal collections and recently began digitizing rare film from Egypt film history. Just quickly before we go through the collection, I will just try to take you to a visit to Cinematech as a space and show you the place. This is our, Cinematech is based on a residential flat. Actually, we worked for 5 years with the support of many of our friends all over the world to build this place. It's 3 residential flats that were opened together to create this space. So we have this screening hall that is like, usually we do all our programming there. And we can show all different formats in this room. We have a monthly program that is happening now that is already, like, I think it's for 4 years, with very few exceptions when we had to stop for political reasons. But we have weekly, like 6 screenings a week, almost over this 4 years. We have a cafeteria that is working, also a co-working space. People use it to do sometimes exhibitions or meetings or rehearsals or just production meetings. It's a space that we offer it to the public. We have also a workshop program that is really tackling different practice of filmmaking. That one, for example, was a documentary. It was done with Atelier Varan in Paris about documentary filmmaking. This is a program for young critics called, like, Kurasat, is like the cinema notebooks. We also have a program for kids that was a color grading workshop. I'm just trying to show you, and this is our lab. We do hand processing for analog films. And this is, and thanks to Stefanie, who allowed this to happen. This is the moviola of Haroun Farouki that is now located at Cinematech, and we use it for our lab. And this is also our scanner. That was just like to give you an idea of what is Cinematech as a space and as an initiative. And because of the political situation in Cairo that I'm sure many of you are aware of, we felt that we have a collection and we need to protect this collection. And then in a discussion with Stefanie, we had this idea of digitizing everything and having a copy of this collection in Berlin. I just want to mention that in the beginning, that archive was not part of our mandate. Actually, it wasn't part of how we envisioned Cinematech in the first place. It was, but we found ourselves in this situation of dealing with the archive, because once people started to know about what we are doing, we we were receiving every day donation from different people. Just people came and gave us like boxes and boxes and boxes of archives. And that was coming from different people, sometimes like some established filmmakers or cineasts who have their own archive and they donated it to us, or even like friends or just people who has some material and they don't know what to do with it and gave it to us. I think like now when I look back on this thing, I think this is because of what Stefanie mentioned, is that the fact that the archive in Egypt is not accessible. So no one wants to give its own collection to this archive because people wants to use this archive to transfer knowledge to the others. So that's why they kept it at their place, and that's why they give it to Cimatec at some point. Of course, when we started, it wasn't easy at all because we didn't have any experience of how to deal with the archive or how to manage a collection or whatever. And this collection, as I mentioned, was very, very diverse. Like, we were lucky because Yasmin, the archivist who joined Cimatec in 2013, she studied film history and archive and film restoration in NYU in the US. She's Egyptian, and she moved to Cairo after the revolution. And so we were lucky to have her with us, and we started together. And she started to work on this big collection. And I would say over the last 5-6 years, and all the credits goes to her. Of course, she made a real miracle. So basically, we were receiving items like this, like boxes full of things that even the people who brought it to us, they don't know what's inside. And inside this thing, there are so different things, like posters, reports, official reports, drawings, films. And then over these years, Yasmin and her team managed to work on this collection and clean everything, not everything, but most of it, and started to classify and put everything in place. And as you all know, it's a very, very, very long process that never ends. And we opened this archive to the public. And we were very surprised how, like, of the footage we found there and the material we found there. At the same time, we were very surprised how looking at this material will allowing not only us but everybody to recreate the narrative of our country over the last maybe 70, 80 years. These are different, just to give you an example of what we have. This is the original costume designs, for example, of a very famous film, Shafi'a Mutwalli, even with some samples of the fabrics that was used. And this is the album of the film. We did some workshops around this archive, and actually, and even like old contracts, old documents that personally I didn't know that in the 40s and 50s, Egyptian films were exported to more than 30, 40 countries all over the world, including Germany, and they were making some money from Europe and from Latin America and from Australia, And we have all these records there. That was just to give you an idea of what is Cinematheque and what kind of collection we have. What we are talking about today, which is what do we do in this situation when the archive is in threat, and how to move it to a different place, and what does it mean? And of course, this is raising many questions. I personally experienced something similar, like moving the archive to Germany was also happening parallel to me moving to Berlin for similar yet different reasons. And I'm asking myself always, like, the story of me trying to adapt myself to live in Berlin, how this is going to resonate with the story of the archive in Berlin, like this kind of similarity. I'm also one of the reasons why I moved to here, plus that I have a child living in Berlin who is like now 3 years old, but also because my film is banned in Cairo and I found it difficult to work there. So I was all the time, while I'm thinking of what do I do here and how can I open up to the city or find something to relate to, I'm also having the same question with the archive. I think that the last part of my presentation is I selected some items of this archive and I wanted to share it with you. And I wish you can think while you are looking at these items, what do you think of them? And could you imagine the difference between looking at them here in Dresden in this conference, or in Berlin in Arsenal, or in Cairo, and how these items will raise different questions or different discourses or create a dialogue. And this is because also I think us in Cinematheque and in the Arsenal, and me and Stefanie are asking ourselves a lot, is it a shelter or it's a new life for this archive? And we hope, like today, to receive some feedback from you to allow us to define how can we deal with this. So, the big part of our archive is documents, and this is like, for example, is like we have maybe 2,000 of this. These are the reports of the censorship about treatments or scripts presented to the censorship during the 50s and 60s. And I selected this one because it's really interesting what's written here. So basically this part, they are saying they allow this film to be shot, but with some changes. The first thing is the way the crime is presented in the houseboat when Omar killed Zinat. It has to be because he is a bad person, not because he needs money to feed his kids. And here they are saying we need to be careful with the يعني إيه الحشمة؟ It's being conservative. Yeah. Yeah, being appropriate and avoid any sexual excitement, especially in the relation between Zinad, the woman, and Galal. I don't know who is Galal. And then after all this, if the censorship finds something that is not matching all these criteria, then they have the right to ban the film. For example, this document is including all the banned films in Egypt between 1952 and 1970, and the reason of why each film was banned. And of course, there are many films that were banned because they were insulting Islam or insulting Arabs. Don't know how to close this. Sorry? I did escape, but it doesn't. Yes. Actually, this one is interesting because we realize, we found in one box a document made by what is called the Egyptian Egyptian Cultural Center for Cinema. That was actually located at the same street where Cinematheque is located in downtown Cairo. And we realized through reading this document that there were people in 1954 trying to build a Cinematheque in the same street. And this is something that we didn't know about before. So that was just some of the documents, and then I will show you also some films, some clips of the films. And of course, there are many questions around these films, like, for example, to which extent these images are helping to reread the narrative, and to which extent these images are challenging the stereotype or setting up the stereotype. And also to which extent these films are representing or giving a space to people to represent the people in a way that they can feel happy about it. And again, the main question is, what does it mean to look at these images here or there? So, as a tradition in the Egyptian cinema, we always start with a newsreel. So I decided to start with a newsreel that I found. It's a very short one. It's coming from and I didn't understand why it was done in English. So you don't need a translation. This newsreel was produced in 1969. It's not clear to me why it was done in English. And it's about a monkey in Belgrade.
The monkey Viga was born in the Leningrad Zoo in 1967. It is the only pet in the zoo of chimpanzee species. Viga receives extra care from the guards, while the supervising veterinary performs a daily checkup on the young monkey. Viga has physical training periods and receives meals at fixed hours. It gets enough sleep at night to wake up fresh in the morning.
The next one is a clip from Super 8 material, and sorry, 16 millimeter material that we scan it at, we did the scanning at Cimatec. We received this material from the Jesuit. It's, and apparently it was shot by the monks during the time when they were building a church in Minya, which is a governorate in Upper Egypt, about 450 kilometers from Cairo to the south. It's a raw footage, it's not edited, and I selected one roll to show it to you. There is no sound. Maybe we can make the light, yeah. I'm also asking myself, like, what do I feel about showing these images? The next one is, it's a home movie, also done with Super 8. We got it from the flea market, and we don't know, like, it's interesting because it has a very, yeah, I cannot say when exactly it was shot, and maybe I can say something about it after we look at it. It's very short. Sorry? Yeah, man, this is, I'm thinking. I'm still thinking. No, it's raising this question of representation, you know. It's also like, you know, this voyeurism eye that is this way of looking at the people and present them, looking for the something that is very strange. But for me, it's not strange, you know. I'm very familiar with these images. But it's also, the thing is, when you present it sometimes in a context, it's just, it's also a way of setting a stereotype. So these are the questions that comes to my head. Yeah. Actually, the last one is for me is very interesting, because the first time I looked at the images, I thought this is in Egypt, but actually it's in America. And you realize this the moment you see the money. It's a dollar, and then this whole family is an Egyptian family in America, and you see them inside and outside, and it's yeah. The next one is also a news reel, but it's for the BBC. It's done by the BBC about the bread riot in 1977. And this one is done in, there is an English narration, so you can understand it.
On the croquis lawns of the Gezira Club, Cairo's leisured class shelters from the great city crumbling and rotting outside. The past 3 years have seen a revival in the fortunes of the Egyptian bourgeoisie. In this citadel of gentility, slightly frayed round the edges like most things in Egypt of today, they can relax and forget how far too many of their number are exploiting President Sadat's economic liberalization and paying their club subscriptions from the profits of corruption. The Gezira, in its old-fashioned and harmless way, is a playground for the privileged. But will the sons of privilege do any better than their fathers in tackling the poverty that has turned much of Cairo into one huge and seedy slum? A hotbed for the discontent which exploded last week into the most vicious riots experienced here since Egypt became independent in 1952. Shubra is a notorious slum quarter, swollen by a continuous influx of peasants, fellahin, who'd rather take their chance scraping by on an urban pittance than labouring away for as little money and less hope in the Nile Delta. Egypt's poor produce big families. The country's population is 40 million, rising by 1 million every year, always tantalizingly ahead of any economic progress made. And the poor seek homes where they can. They've even colonized the City of the Dead, Cairo's biggest cemetery, which now has schools among the tombs for the families who live there. In trying to spur the Egyptian economy into life, to escape from the paralysis of the Nasser days, President Sadat made a serious political blunder. He underestimated the growing desperation of most Egyptians coping with inflation on a few pounds a week. Last week, workers and students erupted in protest when food prices were raised, not just in Cairo and Alexandria, but in towns throughout Egypt. 79 deaths have been admitted and 1,000 injured. The mindless mob, of course, took over, but the worst battles were in the poorest areas. The army joined police in quelling the disorders. Both forces, it said, were unhappy at the task they were assigned, but they cracked down with vigor. Their intervention succeeded. In Cairo alone, 2 days of rioting blazed a trail of damage. The government decided to blame a communist plot, an explanation few believed, but all recognized as a suitable encouragement to the fiercely anti-communist Saudi Arabia to cough up much-needed emergency aid from their oil billions. The rioters made a special beeline for Cairo nightclubs, gutting them and looting them with a zest that suggested either religious disapproval or envy at the blatant luxury they embody in such contrast to the average Egyptian's penury. And President Sadat himself now cannot escape insult.
And this one, whether I agree or disagree of the narrative he's creating, but of course, like anyone who visits Cairo knows that there is a lot, many, real, how can I say, wrong informations about the city. Yeah. The last one I want to show is actually a very short one. It's also a newsreel. I finished with a newsreel. It's less than a minute. It's a piece of newsreel about visiting of Palestinian kids to Berlin during the 60s. And it's a piece that I keep thinking of it because my son, who is also half Arab, is living in Neukölln, and he's 3 years old now. And the more I look at these images, while seeing also the immigration in all the questions that comes with the immigration that happened, the immigrants that came to Berlin in the last years. So anyway, let's look at it.
دعت حكومة ألمانيا الديمقراطية مجموعة من الأطفال الفلسطينيين ممن فقدوا أسرهم لزيارة المدن والمقاطعات الألمانية، وتضمن برنامج الزيارة جولة في مدينة برلين، والتقى الأطفال الألمان مع الأطفال العرب في رحلات ترفيهية، كما قدمت الهدايا التي تعبر عن روح الصداقة الحقة التي تربط ألمانيا الديمقراطية بالشعب العربي.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So we start with a response by Filipa, César.
Thank you so much, Stefanie. Tamer, thank you for your presentation. So many ideas came, of course, through your presentation. That is a project that I also have been accompanying, and since the project that I was doing parallel, the Guinean Archive project was kind of happening at the same time, and also Stefanie and the Arsenal created several encounters of our projects. One thing that I would like to, of course, I prepared something that is a response directly to your last film you showed. But one of the things that I would like to first address was in the episodes that I experienced in the past 8 years, working with Sanana Ada and Flora Gomez on the archive of Guinea-Bissau of the liberation movement. So for those that don't know, it's very shortly, it was a project that I accompanied with them on digitizing the images of the remains of the images they produced during the liberation war from Portuguese colonialism from 67 through 1980. I mean, the war ended in 74, but their production, this militant production, went through to 1980 when there was a coup d'etat that basically stopped that production. And I mean, I'm a filmmaker, so I was never thought myself as an archivist, and when one of the reasons why I was kind of like sucked into this project was actually by the fact that once I was shown this archive that was in a kind of a process of advanced process of decomposition, the first intuition I had was to show it to Portuguese Cinematheque in order to ask them to act or to know about it, and I only start to be involved in it from the moment that I was told by the archivist that this archive, the Guinean archive, was irrelevant. And this was the moment where I was interested in the fact that an institution is able to decide what is relevant and what is irrelevant. And for me was suddenly about all the system of producing documents or keeping documents or deciding the documents are important for the future or not. So this for me was actually the moment where I thought it was interesting that was not anymore only about the material of the archives, but also the system that is around and that produces the archive. And this is, I just wanted to tell a little bit, a little episode that actually also basically changes how to change the status of a document. And this was when, in the beginning of the process of making the catalog of the archive, we had a conflict with the filmmakers, and I had a conflict with the institute director, where actually the archive was host, and that he was deciding that the filmmakers could not show the images, and in that moment there was a conflict where the filmmakers told the director of this institute that actually these images were thrown away during the war of 98. They were thrown away by the state, and the filmmakers found them on the street and recovered them. So basically, from the moment they said these images are not anymore state images, but they were found footage that we found on the streets of Bissau. And I think that was a really interesting moment where this conflict of like what is actually found footage, what is actually, from the which moment it is actually, it becomes something that belongs to an institution or not. And that was such an interesting conflict. From that moment we were only dealing with the filmmakers and not anymore with the institute for a period of time. Now it came back, but there was this moment where we decided that the filmmakers created that kind of, like they said, these images were found by us. I mean, they were also shot by us, but they were also found by us on the streets in a way to create a space of freedom to deal with the images. So I'm just going just to be short, to bring back the connection to my response to Tamer. Was that we also had found images in this archive that created a kind of migration, not only in the images, but also created this wish to reflect about the present through the images. And this is a little bit, so I'm going to show you very fast. This is okay. So I just allow myself to freeze some images from the archive, and this was an episode that was recorded by Sananada in 1973, when a group of young children from schools, during the war, so this is during the Liberation War, a group of young students from the schools in the liberated zones came to East Berlin to the youth festival. I don't know exactly the name, but and what I thought it was interesting was, I mean, what I'm not showing here is actually how the young the German children are welcoming the Guinean children. That actually Sana told about these images that eventually it was the first time that these kids have been in like an urban place in their lives, because they were coming directly, they were collected eventually in Conakry, in the neighbor countries of around Guinea-Bissau, in Conakry or in Senegal, and brought directly to Berlin. So basically they would have eventually never been in a city. And here you see them giving autographs and sharing T-shirts and with the German kids. And these images we showed in Berlin after, as Stefanie said, we did after digitizing this material, we made a mobile cinema through Guinea-Bissau. It was very long sessions of like 3 hours of showing the footage and discussing it with the population. And then we ended up this trip in Berlin and decided to make this screening with some of the people leading the refugee movement in Berlin at that time in 2000, and this was 2015. And you have here Bino Biacolec on the left side, Napoli, also Lennart Malmer, that was a Swedish filmmaker, also a militant filmmaker that shot a lot in Guinea-Bissau, Sananada, and Mohamed Lamin. And so one of the things we thought it was really important, and actually it was not us as like, or me as a curator of this screening, but this idea came also from showing to the refugees leading this movement at Oplatz at that time, and the archive, and they said, we need to show these images here in Berlin, because these images, I mean, I'm talking about these images of the German children welcoming the Guineans, because he said that this is, it creates an arc of narrative, an historical narrative that it's important for us to relate to. And because we are here for a certain reason, and we are doing this movement, and at that time, and this moment of the liberation movements, there was all these solidarity connections, and it was important for them to also to show these bodies, you know, like connecting and celebrating this connection. So I liked a lot how, and actually it was Bino Biancoleca's idea. Like I said, we have to show these images now in Berlin. And I think that was actually, I'm just saying this because this is actually what interested me in this project. I'm not so interested in archives as such. I'm not an archive freak. I'm interested in what these kind of processes can activate, or kind of or can maybe remember us of connections that are there, but we don't want to see them. And I think this was just an example. I mean, the archive the project was very extensive, but this is just to give an example how we operated the archive in a sense. We use it. It was not about re-archiving or digitizing and close it back. It was about using it to make this process happening. That's it.
My response to this project is coming also from, like you. I'm not an archive freak as well, I mean, I've used archives in my work, but I'm much more interested in my practice also in projects that somehow deal with archival thinking, as opposed to just collecting or rescuing or creating new archives, but also projects that make us think and rethink the archive, the document, the trace. So in that sense, my initial response, of course, also is influenced by my connections to both institutions, which I've worked with in different capacities. And the first two things that come to mind are a term also that Stefanie used, which is the counter archive, which is very much, I think it's a very precise term in describing the Cinematheque archive, precisely because of the historical moment in which it was created, and the need for a counter-narrative to, at a time when it's, you know, it became very difficult to have access to those narratives. The other term I keep thinking of course, is a living archive, which is something that is like a term or a phrase that is used frequently by Arsenal as a way to challenge what an archive normally, traditionally, even etymologically represents. Also, as was mentioned earlier today, the idea of the arche and the archeon, and that also somehow necessitates thinking about a site, a location. There's always a site of consignation. So the idea of a living archive, the idea of having or granting more access to the archive, somehow challenges this very idea of the archive also being a shelter for the protection of these documents, which forces an institution, for instance, like both actually like Arsenal or Cinematheque, to consider approaches or strategies that would open up the archive, while at the same time ensuring the protection and the shelter for these for the contents of these archives. So I actually, and because this project is still happening, so I'm formulating all these thoughts in terms of, or in the form of questions, of course, both to Tamer and Stefanie, but I think the whole point of doing this while the project is still happening is that this can also be a good form of publicly discussing some of those questions and responding to them. So the first thing when it comes to counter archive, my question would be if, like, to what extent could this archive in that sense, or this mirror, be a counter archive, not only in terms of its content, but also in terms of its form, and what actually makes a counter archive a counter archive. And here I'm always actually interested in the way that Antoinette Burton refers to this idea of the counter archive in her book, Archive Fever, Archive Stories, where she says basically that the archives, as much as they are telling stories, that the archives are always already stored. So in that sense, I would be very interested, beyond just the showing of the images and the protection of them, but also of the story of how this, whether the original archive or the mirror, comes to life, and the kind of questions and concerns involved in the process. For instance, like just some of the images that we've even seen, I think, for me at least, it raises questions not just about where they're shown, but also about who's showing these, not only today, but also who has produced these images. And even though, like, I'm not sure even if the one with the monks in Minya, if these monks are Egyptian or they're, so, which actually raises a lot of questions also about the aesthetic education, that it's not necessarily like an Orientalist gaze, but how this gaze could also be internalized. But even with Cinematech, I mean, it's a very interesting story, not just, I mean, yes, it's material that was donated and that was kept by Cinematech, but even within that, there are still power structures, right, involved. There's still connections. There's still, for example, who knows even about Cinematech's existence to be able to donate this material. And at the same time, there are also some implicit, let's say, decisions made by inclusion, exclusion, even if they decide a decision not to exclude anything, that in itself is a decision. So there is a lot of politics and stories happening there that could actually be interesting, even in many ways, just as interesting and as important as the keeping and the showing of the images themselves. I want to read a very short passage by Antoinette Burton, where she says, archives produce speech, and especially speech effects, of which history is but one. Talking about that speech and its effects, and arguing over its meanings, is vitally important for history as a practice. As a practice, especially at a moment when many other disciplines invoke history as a self-evident methodological procedure and the archive as its instrument. And therefore, this questioning of not only the materiality, but the factuality and the truth of the archive, and of this particular archive, would, I think, or could possibly contribute to it being a counter-archive, or to embrace this counter-archiveness in its form, as opposed to just the type of materials that it presents. The second question comes with, I mean, very basically also comes with geography, because as we're talking about migration of archives, we're also talking about a big migration movement from not only Egypt, but from a lot of Arabic speakers to Germany. And of course, what's interesting about those archives is that they're not only accessible to Egyptians, but to, I mean, to Lebanese and to Palestinians and to all Arabic speakers. So this migration, which is taking also many different forms, one of it is through asylum, but also there are a lot of professionals. I mean, especially in the case of Egyptians, actually, a lot of professionals, a lot of artists, a lot of academics, of intellectuals that are moving to Berlin. And in that sense, then, this question of the mirror of the archive and how it could become a living archive in Berlin, it's also, if there's a possibility that this exchange becomes both ways somehow. That, you know, how the archive being placed in Berlin is not only a copy, but then also is a living mirror of this archive, whereby it could actually be not only accessible to the audience here, but what could come out of it in terms of the interpretation of the archive and the use of the material. And I think this migration actually is quite helpful, because if it were the case maybe in another place, then the audience, or the question of the audience, would be very much more, much easier. But here, because you have this movement and you have this migration, it definitely also creates a much more sophisticated audience and a much more complex audience to deal with in Berlin and in Germany, because then also this movement has questioned a lot of the politics of representation that you know, might not be the case in many other countries where you do not have this this exchange going on. My final, sorry, and actually, like, this is also a question that we discussed briefly the other day, and it's a big question, but also being in Egypt, being in Cairo, being in Berlin, in Germany, even the questions of memory and forgetting and remembering, like, are also quite different. And even, you know, also because the magnitude and the time of the catastrophe, or the thinking of the catastrophe, is quite different. And we had this conversation briefly the other day about how, you know, like, how much distance also does each location have from the catastrophe, like, as in Egypt, it's actually kind of unfolding as we are right now, and then you have really the luxury of, like, sitting back and, like, thinking and rethinking and having time, like, and having this distance. And if actually the location of the archive, or the Mirror of Archive being in Berlin, could possibly give this this space of reflection, I don't know. The final thing is also something that has to do with the process of mirroring or copying, especially with two institutions that have a very strong affinity to analog as well, right? And also at the same time, two institutions who are not necessarily, like, ideologically opposed to digital, but somehow we're faced with like an interesting situation, because I mean I started making films, like, when actually, like, I mean, when filmmaking was digital. I actually started using analog. I learned this at Cinematech when I was, like, 30, so I was already making films, and then it became like, so I didn't go through this transition. So I don't have this, like, strong, you know, like, affinity to analog, as, like, and the quality of analog and whatever. And then, like, there's always, at least in Egypt, there's always this conversation, because you have people who are ideologically opposed to using digital. And actually, even in Germany, like, I've had some of these conversations. But also you have the ones who believe in digital and sort of, like, strongly opposed to analog, like, for political reasons, for subversive reasons, you know, like, for the economic reasons as well. And then we're forced with something where actually you have to deal with analog and digital in whichever way, because maybe, I mean, it's a question, of course, but Stefanie and I were having this conversation earlier, that unlike the case maybe in Guinea-Bissau, where, like, actually the movement of analog films in and out of Egypt is quite difficult to be able to make these films travel and go through customs and go through censorship. And there are, of course, a lot of interesting stories already. So I don't know how possible this is, but also at the same time, how could the copies be completely safe when it's digital? And I think maybe, I mean, Stefanie has a lot more to say, because I'm not so sure exactly about how this works in Germany. But I was thinking earlier that how digitization, I mean, the computer, like, especially in Germany, like, there is a very bad history of the computer, like, with a lot of research about the IBM. The first IBM, or like one of the earlier versions, how it's actually been used in systematic archivization of Jews in leading to the concentration camps. But at the same time, like, how could this digitization somehow be, like, if used ethically, be a form of shelter, of protection, and not of erasure? But at the same time, this computer and this digitization, which is capable of multiplying, which is capable of archiving, which is capable of sheltering, is also capable of erasure, right? So then this becomes the question: if you just have the digital version somewhere, like, how safe they are, given the limitations of the form and technology itself. Yes, and I end here my questions.
Thank you, Shawky, for your response. I would like to briefly, before I let you answer, Tamer, say something about the very last thing that you mentioned, that you brought up when you suggested the digital as a form of archive. And there is, I mean, this is a big other topic actually, because we have there is the policy, the official policy in Germany is that the preservation of film is done through digitization, whereas most film professionals would not agree with that at all, because the only really safe material for film is still 35 millimeter, and we don't know yet what's going to happen with the digital. And so there are different policies about that. But when you suggest that, there is something else that I find important, which is, as you said, we cannot carry analog film prints from Egypt to Germany, vice versa. So there is something about another level, let's say, of preservation, which is making sure that the films stay in a collective memory or in the memory of someone, which is also for us often the reason why we decide when we restore films, and we don't have the budget to do both analog and digital restoration, and then we decide, even though the analog would be safer, we decide to do it digitally because this is it's a lot easier these days than to circulate the films. Most cinemas don't have analog projectors anymore, and we think that seeing the films, showing the films and seeing the films is equally important in terms of preservation as the technical side of it, because if nobody remembers a film, then it's lost. So it has to go hand in hand. So this is one thing, and the other point that I think we can talk a bit more about is there were two terms that came up a couple of times: relevance and counter archive or counter cinema. The question would be, first of all, how they are connected in some ways. And Filipa, you mentioned that the archive in Guinea-Bissau was in the first place not considered as relevant, even though it is enormously relevant in, here and there and everywhere, from a different point of view, of course. And what I thought is that now when the films from Guinea-Bissau, the digital copies are at Arsenal, and the Cinematheque films are coming to the Arsenal, and the films that are already there in our archive are actually finished films, documentaries or fiction films, or experimental films, but it's not this kind of footage. Actually, it's not newsreels, it's not the rushes or home movies. This has not yet been what entered the Arsenal archive, and that brings me to the point that what we have shown in the Berlinale Forum, therefore kept in the archive, has also often in the beginning been considered as not so relevant or irrelevant in terms of production, where it was produced, how it was produced, maybe in connection with this idea of counter cinema. And this is something that these days becomes more and more relevant actually in film studies, the production context, the context of a film production. And now we are more and more dealing with the context of not the production, but where the films are found. As you said, the films as found footage. So the context of their location, where they physically are and should be. So this is something else. And then now maybe Tamer, you want to respond to some of Shawky's points, and then and then also after that, I would like Filipa also to talk a little bit about the process of decision making in terms of first of all, how the films are digitized, what you can still see from the analog. That were some decisions that you made, and the decision that the analog, and this is maybe even more important in this context, the analog and the digital material would go back to Guinea-Bissau, whereas a duplicate, let's say, or a set of digital copies stayed in Berlin. And what kind of decisions were behind that?
Yeah, it's too many things, so I will try to answer very briefly. I mean, first of all, I'm not sure that we need to answer everything. It's more like we need to think of everything you said. I mean, I think everything Filipa and Shawky mentioned is very relevant to what we are doing, and it's important to rethink of all these things. For me, I think yes, what you mentioned about the inclusion and the exclusion of the audience, and in terms of accessibility, and it's of course a very important question. In general, I just want to mention that working on the archive, the way we are working on is very, very, very costly. Archive needs money, needs a lot of money, and usually archive is the mission of the state. So it's very it's not common that a private institution or an initiative that is founded by a group of filmmakers, none of them has any interest in the archive before is taking this responsibility. It's something that came to us. It wasn't started from us, and then we had to deal with it. I'm like both of you. I see myself as a filmmaker, and I want to continue in this. We are doing this because no one else is doing this. But of course, we wish that also the political situation in Cairo is creating this situation where you always in constant battle between to which extent you go public, while you want to open your doors, but also you want to protect the space and the people there, so you need to work underground. So this question is how you exist and be a public space while like this this state is putting you in risk. The last thing is about the infrastructure. Of course, if you want to, accessibility is so connected to infrastructure. And when you don't have money, when most of the people are under payment, everyone is under payment, and many of them are doing this like voluntarily. Then there is no infrastructure. You try to build this infrastructure while you are making the process itself. Like the project is not based on infrastructure, but you try to build the infrastructure while you are making the project itself. This is a complete different situation that is for sure affecting the policies and the decision making of every step you take. The other thing that I think you mentioned, and it's very important, it's like I tell you what's my big wish, and it's so connected to also to how I think of me living in Berlin, or how I think of my son or anything. I found the archive the answer, not the question. Like I found the archive is giving us a possibility to bring people together. Actually, I think I like a lot what you said about that this distance of Egypt and of Cairo is giving us a moment when we can reflect and rethink and recreate our narrative and give this counter. I would call it even alternative, not necessarily counter narrative to exist. And my wish and my hope, and this is what we need to discover, is how to use this as a tool to bring people together and to give them material and tool to use it. The last thing I want to say is I can't agree more on what you both mentioned, is that the process in itself is a narrative, and it's in some cases it's even more important than the story, the content of this archive, and also how this archive is echoing. Like today, for example, look what happened. Like I didn't know that Filipa has this short clip. I didn't know the story of the kids from Guinea-Bissau coming to Berlin, but and I came with this idea thinking that I found something very surprising, and then I came to you saying, look what I found. And actually Filipa was having even something more interesting, that she brought it and she screened it in Berlin 3 years ago. So this kind of, and like, this is the only thing that like over the last years while working on this collection, this is the biggest fun of working on the archive, that it's constantly, you are surprised. And there is something that you find a piece of information, and then it echoes with something else, and then you put the two together, and then you create a third story, then it echoes with something else. So this thing of evolving, and that's why this term that, thanks to Hassan and Stefanie who did this project, Living Archive, is something that is changing the whole concept of how we deal with this footage. Yeah, I don't know, I think I said.
Thank you, Tamer. Yeah, I mean, it's exactly that. It's about what it produces in that very present, and that's why the paradox is so interesting in living an archive. But what I wanted to address is that for us, doing this project it became clear in the beginning that since it was a militant film production, it was about images that were being produced against colonization and during the struggle, the armed struggle, where really worlds were being created, like the liberated zones, or where children had schools, during the war, and it was very clear that to deal with this archive, we had to prolong this militant gesture. I mean, we didn't. I can't. I mean, from my, Sana is a guerrilla filmmaker, a proper guerrilla filmmaker. He was with the guerrilla people in the war without the gun, but with a camera. So, and he till today has this militant echoes all. His being in the world echoes that. So I was very interested about being contaminated, how to find a kind of translation of that gesture into the way we were dealing with the archive. So one of the things, and connects with what Tamer said about like bringing people together, was very much, we didn't have money in the beginning. It was very difficult, Stefanie knows, to get the little money that we got to digitize these images, and it was, even if we would say how much, nobody would believe that we did that we digitized with that money 40 hours of film and 200 hours of sound. But it was only possible because we created a connection with people, like Rainer, that was inventing at that moment. He had the prototype, his first prototype of a digitalization machine specialized in archives, that he said, okay, this material is so rotten, it's so destroyed, the archive of Guinea-Bissau, that no, you cannot digitize this material as a normal process, or you have first to restore them, and this costs millions, and then you can start the process of digitalization. And so basically we had this kind of guerrilla process of digitalization, because we were like, we don't have this money, so what can we do? And Rainer said, okay, we can digitize these images that are falling apart, but you will only have like one chance, and this is what you will get after. So the material is going to break apart in the process of digitalization. So we had to create, in order to not be attacked by the cinema experts, we had to invent concepts of like, and instead of saying we are digitizing the archive, we decided we are digitizing the materiality of this archive that includes the perforation, the sound track. So basically we were not just digitizing the images, but also the way the support of the film is decomposing and also producing an image on top of that image, and how that is also an image in a way, like all this decomposition, and also this decomposition that is eventually also part of the neglect, part of the neo-colonial processes of these countries. So they are also an inscription on that is valid. So basically we were inventing concepts of dealing with this material in order to be able to produce these images that I never say they are the original image, that they are a transfer to another material of what we found. And we found a kind of a pathology of film in a way, pathological condition of film. And this pathology of film was transferred to another medium. So basically it was all about inventing concepts, very inspired by, Sana saying, no, this is not the archive of the state of Guinea-Bissau. This is the found footage that we just rescued after the war. So how can you, in a context of commodification and institutionalization of certain how to deal, how do you deal with film archive, and how could we bring everything to another economical situation as well, because we didn't have a lot of money, so we created what we invented this word cine kinship. We invented a kind of friendship between people that were interested in dealing with it and inventing solutions to transfer this to a medium that we could then relate to and activate and reflect about, all this process of making history or making something that is relevant for, so just to give you a little bit a concept of how we deal with it.
We should also open to the public. Are there any questions or comments at that point? So then maybe, Filipa, because the second part of my question was the decision that the analog footage would go back to Guinea-Bissau, and the digital set would stay in Berlin. Could you also talk about that, and then maybe we can talk about.
Yeah. I also want to ask Shawky a question, if possible. Maybe after Philippe, I want to ask him how, because it's good to hear also how does it feel to look at these images here,
Or in Dresden.
But maybe Philippe.
You want me to? It's an open question, but it's an open answer. The material was important for us that the things go back. That was that they come and go, and they are. They also have a status. As something that comes and goes back. Also in the Zoll system. In the Alfanga, how you say the border dealing, we had to bring back customs, exactly. So, and of course it was very important to bring also a digitalization of the material in that kind of new format. And there was a lot of plans to do websites, and I had a first idea of burning DVDs, because that was what's in the markets in Guinea-Bissau on the streets at that time. Now it's different. Now it's USB sticks. But at the moment, the things. What was more important was to find formats of how to share that. But it's still open. We don't have an answer. The things are in Guinea, the filmmakers have access to it. They are not very clear how they want to disseminate it, because the political situation is still very unstable there. There's not a real place where people can go and access things. So everything is still in it's in a process. But that gesture of bringing back the material was from the beginning a condition also for me, an ethical gesture, of course. And ideally, in the beginning, we wanted to make the digitalization in Guinea, but it didn't work because of the coup d'etat of 2012. So we had to.
Yeah, just like I want to add one thing because I was thinking a lot because you were saying, you know, we have this word, this title, mirror. Now I'm asking myself, and like this is because of this conversation, and I'm very grateful for all of you too, because I'm asking myself, is it really a mirror? A mirror? Like, is the mirror, is the archive or the experience? And this is like a question that we think of. Maybe we should call it, is it a mirror instead of a mirror?
So no, you were asking me about how it feels to watch these images, and my I mean, I don't know. It's not just about seeing them in Berlin, but I mean, we've had these conversations before, and I don't know. I don't know if it's appropriate to say this in a conference or a congress about archives. But I was telling Tamer last time after the program he curated out of the archive that I'm really saturated with these images, and at least for me, it's always like what I'm thinking about is I also want to produce images, and sometimes I think of how like aesthetically I can be saturated with like a certain way of seeing that I'm not so sure how beneficial it is for me to see over and over, and maybe it's interesting for like in terms of research to look at these and critique them, but I don't know, I feel like we can keep critiquing them forever and forever, and we know what are the problems with them, and I think everyone here can really analyze each one of those images and really tell what's problematic with them. And for me, I'm just interested in finding new languages and not be trapped in this. And this is why, like I'm always saying, it's problematic to say this in Germany, but I feel like I need more to forget than to remember that. You know, I'm not interested in seeing how Egyptians were portrayed or how propaganda works in Egypt. We know it works. I mean, I don't know. Like, so yeah, I don't know. That's how I feel.
The thing is also, I'm also not sure if I heard you very well. Maybe you are planning to relocate your archive, the Cinematheque, from Cairo to Egypt to Germany. But there's also, before I come to that, to take a cue from you just now about the sort of tiredness of seeing the same old images up and down, raises the question for me as an archivist who live and work in Nigeria. And it's the question of archival practice is not abstract to me. And there is also no archival fever because I'm an archive freak. And for the simple reason also is that there is the question, what is the relationship actually between the archive and the society? Is it just for the sake of maybe research or remembering and all? Does it trigger conversation, debate as to exactly where we are coming from and where we are at the particular moment? So it's instructive also that the situation we find ourselves is happening against a global backdrop of the movement of African people to Europe. So I find myself in a situation which 2 weeks before I left Berlin, we were discussing the translocation of museum pieces and how to take it restitution. And I was the only black person in the two instances. So if an archive relocates itself from its origin, who becomes your audience, your public, and what do you talk about? I find a situation in which African intellectual academics and artists in Europe, they spend a lot of time talking about post-colonialism. In 2019, African intellectuals are still discussing post-colonialism in Europe, and among them are Nigerian intellectuals. And they are not talking about the post-war, which is the singular most traumatic incident in Nigeria that made the army to attempt to conceal, to hide the archive. And now, because we have a sort of civilian regime, we are beginning to unearth the archive. We are beginning to have relationship with this archive again. If the Nigerian archive suddenly relocates to Berlin, so what is now the nature of the archive What is it still the same? What do we talk about if it's no longer that is still relevant to the society originally from which it was produced? So, correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm thinking that you are thinking of relocating your archive from Cairo.
Yeah, but I didn't get the last part. What did you say? The last part, I didn't get it. Yes.
Is your archive relocating itself from Cairo? And if it does, is it still the same archive? What becomes the topic? What are you going to discuss? What is the nature of the archive? Does relocation not distort the nature of the archive itself if it moves? So, or is it just an antiquated building with old films? Is that the nature of how we think of an archive?
Yeah, I mean, this is what we are going to discover. I think it's not. I think also the archive is changing every day. You know, it's as my feeling. Like this is what I said in the beginning. Like, you know, archive. It's always about here and now. Like if this immigration movement didn't happen and we are looking at these images of the kids, it's very different. So of course, when we change the context, it's a different archive. I think archive are like people. They communicate differently, and that's why I was in the beginning. I was asking you to imagine how you look at these images here and there, and I personally also I decided to, because it's also a question about like what Shawky was saying about the policies of showing the archive or using this archive. So some of these images, I have a big problem with it. Some of the images that I show today, and I think they are very violent. And it's they are very violent in the way they are portraying people, not only because of the colonialism, or because it's also because, like, you know, I think colonialism or racism or Orientalism is sometimes is an easy answer, but it's also a question: what do you do when you have to brief a reality in few minutes? You know, even if you talk about something you know very well, but the reality is always more sophisticated than what you produce. So how can you kind of brief this reality in very few minutes? This is a situation that we need to ask ourselves. And if this thing doesn't exist, then how do we feel about like how we can communicate the news or transfer the news between us, and how we can know about what's going on around us? So of course the archive is very different when we look at it there or look at it here, and this is what we are going to discover.
And I also think, I think we are also approaching the end, but I also think the question is definitely, is the archive still the same archive? I would say it cannot be. But the second question would be, is the Arsenal archive still the same archive when the Cairo archive enters the Arsenal archive? And I would also say no. It's also changing. I mean, of course, one could say we put it next to the other archive, but that would make no sense. So I do think that both archives will be very different, and an archive is always what it is through its users. And
I just want to say, the archive already changed the moment Filipa played her clip. Like, even just like, you know, this very little coincidence of me or of us meeting today and bringing these images together, I might like bring any different clip and not even showing this thing. But the moment when Filipa played this thing, the archive changed. So I think, and also why it's important to be the same archive. Like, you know, it's that, like, this is also an important question. And
This becomes an issue when you talk about the shelter, the idea of a shelter. Yeah. Because when it's changing, then we cannot really speak of a shelter, because then it's not exactly what we are protecting. It's not exactly what it would have been in Cairo. You know, it's a shelter for an idea maybe, or a memory of the archive, or...
But can I say something? Sorry, we have many mics, but we all like to use the same words. Sharing archive and sharing mics. No, but you know, it's the same thing it's the same idea of asylum, you know? Like if someone is leaving his own country and going to another country, we can't say that this person is the same person who were living in Guinea-Bissau or in Cairo or in Nigeria or in Chile or anything. Once you change the context, then you become different person. So like, I think this is, it's a different, even if it turns into something else, it's also part of the story of these images. Sorry?
For instance, it is change also is in terms of the interpretation you give to the material of the archive in its new location. For instance, the images shown by Filipa, it's actually also, you could strip it of its political meaning in the time it was produced. So here, it could be studied simply straight as maybe a visit of Sana to some children from Guinea-Bissau to Europe. But then there is also the fuller discussion of the period and the processes in which these filmmakers produced this film in the context of the liberation struggle. So it's your new audience and your new location. What is the interpretation they bring to this material, and what becomes also of what is the subject, the topic, the conversation in connection with the materials in the archive?
I just think that this practice with the archive, they just make clear, you know, this animistic dimension of cinema, or cinema, or of like in general, like coming together and in this ritual of watching together something, and it is a ritual of recalling something to this very moment. And I think, and of course, maybe I have this perspective because I've been working for the past 8 years in a very animistic country, but you know, like I more and more I think that there is this kind of like the idea of channeling, you know, like of like going through an experience in a very moment together, and I think this is this dimension of the ritual that makes the sense and the meaning and the ideas, and not so much the thing itself, if it's an image or it's an object, but more, you know, like what happens around it and what it channels and what it kind of produces in that very moment. I mean, this is a little bit, I don't know if it helps, but...
Yeah, I want to say also that this interpretation, look like, we are very good friends. We work together for so many years. And Shawky, for example, is saying he feels very oversaturated with these images, and he wants to produce new ones. For me, I always say the opposite. I always say to myself, the world is full of images. Do they need me to produce new ones? You know, so this is also a question, and I don't think none of us is right or wrong, but this interpretation, I think it's beautiful, because every time I think of the amount of the image that we have in this world, I really ask myself, do I need to produce new? Do I need to produce new images? Or I really should reuse? It's also a matter of consuming, you know, should we produce new ones, or we try to recycle the one that we already have?
Yeah. No, I actually completely agree, and very fast. But I also think it's about the choice of what images you want to reproduce. So that's what I mean. No, these images, I don't want to reproduce those. When I go to Arsenal Archive, for example, because it is a counter cinema archive, so that's a different thing. And I see for the first time I saw Rosa von Braunheim. I was like, okay, this is okay. people do that, you know, or like I remember the first time I saw Omar Amir Alai's film, or you know, like something like this, like, oh, okay, yeah, these are interesting images. Someone is thinking that way. So it's not about, you know, like eradicating images, but also it's about the choice of the image that you want to see or reproduce. You know what I mean? So that's
I think we have to come to an end. I would like to, for those of you who live in Berlin or go to Berlin next week or in June, Tamer is presenting parts of the archive on Wednesday and again in June at the Arsenal. So this is the beginning of a process. So all the Tuesday, not Wednesday, Tuesday.
I'm going Wednesday.
So this is the beginning of a process of decision making in terms of what kind of physicality will this archive have in Berlin? And we would be very happy if you help us with that and participate in this process. And I would like to thank you all for being here. Filipa, Shawky, and Tamer, thank you so much.